The wind on Corvin never stopped blowing dust, and after 11 years, Daniel had stopped noticing it. He walked with his head down, boots crunching over red gravel, a cutting tool strapped to his back, and a scanner clipped to his belt. Corvin was not a place people chose to live. It was a place people ended up, usually after losing something bigger somewhere else. Daniel had lost a war, a unit, and most of the people he once called friends. Now he salvaged old ruins for scrap metal and forgotten technology, selling what he found to traders passing through, just to keep his small shelter powered and his stomach full. Humans were not respected out here. The galaxy had older, stronger, richer species running things, and mankind was seen as a small, struggling race still finding its feet among the stars. Traders were polite enough when they wanted to buy something, but Daniel had grown used to being looked at like he was less important than the cargo in his hands. He did not argue with it anymore. Arguing changed nothing. Digging through old ruins, on the other hand, sometimes changed everything, even if just for a day. That morning, a rare signal had shown up on his scanner, buried deep beneath a collapsed hillside a few hours from his shelter. Most of Corvin's ruins were leftover mining stations or wrecked ships, nothing special. But this signal was different. It came from far below the surface, from something built long before Corvin had ever been mapped by any species Daniel knew of. Curious and a little bored, he had packed a bag and gone to look. It took him most of the day to dig through loose rock and cut through an old metal door that had rusted shut. When he finally pushed it open, dust poured out like breath from an old, sleeping mouth. Inside was a narrow stone chamber, untouched by wind or time, its walls carved with symbols Daniel did not recognize. In the very center of the room, resting on a stone platform, sat a single object about the size of a large melon, smooth and pale, faintly warm to the touch even through his glove. Daniel raised his scanner and pointed it at the object, expecting a reading for old alloy or crystal. Instead, the screen blinked red, then settled on a single word that made him go still: organic. Living. His scanner ran the analysis twice, just to be sure, then gave him something that made even less sense. The biosignature matched a species listed in old galactic records as extinct for over 1,000 years. Dragons. He had heard the word before, mostly in old stories traders told to pass the time on long flights. Tales about massive winged creatures that once ruled entire star systems before some ancient war wiped them out completely. Most people treated the stories as myths, exaggerated legends meant to entertain bored travelers. Standing there, staring at a warm, living object that his scanner insisted was a dragon egg, Daniel was no longer sure the stories were myths at all. He should have called it in. Every rule he had ever followed about salvage work told him to report a find like this to the nearest trading post, let the experts handle it, take whatever reward they offered, and move on with his life. But something about the warmth under his glove made him hesitate. It did not feel like cargo. It felt closer to something alive and waiting, the way a person waits in a quiet room for someone to finally open the door. Daniel crouched beside the stone platform for a long time, listening to nothing but his own breathing and the faint hum of his scanner. Outside, the wind kept blowing dust across the empty hills, the same wind that had covered this chamber and hidden it from the galaxy for 1,000 years. He thought about his life on Corvin, the quiet mornings alone, the traders who barely looked him in the eye, the war that had taken almost everyone he once knew. He thought about how easy it would be to walk away and pretend he had found nothing at all. Instead, he reached out and lifted the egg carefully with both hands. It was heavier than it looked, and warmer than anything should be after sitting in a sealed stone room for centuries. He wrapped it in a piece of cloth from his bag and carried it back through the narrow door, out into the fading light of Corvin's long evening. The wind pulled at his jacket as he climbed the loose gravel slope toward his transport, the egg held close against his chest like something far more precious than scrap metal. He did not know why he had made the choice he made. He only knew that for the first time in 11 long years, he did not feel entirely alone anymore. Behind him, the ancient chamber sat empty and silent once again, its secret finally gone, carried away into a galaxy that had almost forgotten dragons ever existed. Ahead of him, the sky over Corvin was turning a deep orange, the kind of color that made even a hard, dusty world look almost beautiful. Daniel walked faster, eager now to get home. unaware that the object in his arms was about to change far more than his own quiet, forgotten life on the edge of known space. A soft, steady heartbeat came through the cloth wrapping, so faint that Daniel almost convinced himself he had imagined it. He sat on the floor of his shelter that first night, staring at the egg resting in a nest of old blankets, and listened to it breathe. He had built a small padded box for it near the heater, unsure if it needed warmth, but not willing to risk it going cold. Sleep did not come easily. Every hour or so he woke and checked on it, half expecting to find it had cracked open while he was not looking, half afraid it never would. Over the following days, Daniel searched through every old file and record he owned, trying to learn more about dragons. Most of what he found was useless, stories passed between traders, half-true legends with different endings depending on who was telling them. A few older documents, buried in databases nobody bothered updating anymore, mentioned dragons as a real species that once lived across several star systems, feared for their strength and respected for something the records only called the bond, without ever explaining what that meant. All of it agreed on one point. Dragons had vanished during an event called the Cataclysm, a war so old that even the species who fought in it barely remembered the details anymore. Daniel knew he could not keep this discovery entirely to himself forever, not on a world as small and connected as Corvin. Traders talked, and word of an unusual find always spread eventually. So he made a choice and reached out to Rowan, an old friend from his soldier days who now captained a small trading ship and stopped by Corvin every few weeks. Rowan was human too, one of the very few people left who Daniel trusted completely. When Rowan saw the egg sitting in its padded box, he went quiet for a long moment before letting out a low whistle. "You know what happens if the wrong people learn about this," Rowan said, crouching down to look closer without touching it. "Half the council would want it locked away. The other half would want it destroyed before it ever hatches." Daniel nodded slowly. He had already thought about that more than once, lying awake at night. Still, he did not regret bringing the egg home. Something about it felt important in a way he could not fully explain, even to himself. Rowan agreed to help, on one condition. They needed someone who actually understood biology, someone who could tell them whether the egg was healthy, close to hatching, or in danger of dying before it ever got the chance. That was how Yara entered the story. She was an alien scientist Rowan had worked with before, known across a few trading routes for being curious rather than fearful, more interested in understanding strange things than reporting them to the council. When Rowan quietly brought her to Corvin and she saw the egg for herself, her reaction was very different from most people's would have been. She did not step back in fear. She leaned closer, eyes wide, fascinated rather than afraid. "This should not exist," she said softly, running a careful scanner over its smooth surface. "Every record I have ever studied says this species died out completely. And yet here it is, warm, alive, and getting stronger every day." Yara stayed on Corvin longer than she planned, running quiet tests and taking careful notes, always being careful not to draw attention from anyone passing through. She explained to Daniel that the egg's biosignature was changing, growing more complex week by week, a sign that whatever was inside was developing rapidly, faster than anything she had studied before. She also noticed something strange in her readings, small spikes in energy that seemed to happen whenever Daniel was nearby, as if the creature inside was somehow aware of him specifically, responding to his presence in a way it did not respond to anyone else. Word did begin to spread, slowly at first. A trader named Oren, someone Daniel had done small deals with in the past, started asking careful questions during his visits, clearly having heard rumors from somewhere along his usual routes. Daniel kept his answers short and vague, unwilling to trust anyone completely with something this important, even someone he had known for years. Oren did not push hard, but his questions lingered in Daniel's mind long after he left, a quiet reminder that secrets rarely stayed secret for long, especially not ones this big. Each night, Daniel sat beside the egg before sleeping, sometimes talking to it quietly, feeling foolish but unable to stop himself. He told it about Corvin's endless dust storms, about the war he had survived, about the quiet, lonely years that had followed. He did not know if it could hear him or understand any of it. Still, the warmth beneath his hand seemed to pulse a little stronger every time he spoke, as though something inside was listening closely, learning his voice, and slowly, patiently, waiting for the right moment to finally answer him. Cracks spread across the shell just after midnight, thin lines catching the dim light of Daniel's shelter like tiny rivers on a pale stone map. He had fallen asleep in the chair beside the padded box, exhausted after another long day of digging up scrap to trade, and it was the sound that woke him first, a soft, steady tapping from somewhere inside the egg. He sat up fast, heart pounding, and watched as another crack spread wider, then another, small pieces of shell falling away one by one. Yara had left 2 days earlier to gather supplies, promising to return quickly, but Daniel did not wait. He leaned closer, careful not to touch the shell, whispering the same quiet words he had spoken every night for weeks. The cracking slowed for a moment, as if something inside had paused to listen, then continued more urgently than before. A final large piece of shell broke away, and a small, wet, dark shape pushed itself free, blinking against the light for the very first time. It did not look exactly like the old drawings in the ancient records Daniel had studied. It was smaller than expected, roughly the size of a large cat, with sleek dark scales that shimmered faintly blue when the light hit them just right. 2 folded wings pressed close against its narrow body, and a long tail curled protectively around its own small legs. Its eyes, when they finally opened fully, were a deep gold color, and they fixed immediately on Daniel, unblinking, intense, and strangely calm for a creature only seconds old. Daniel held perfectly still, unsure what to do, half expecting the small creature to hiss or pull away from him. Instead, it took a few shaky steps forward, still weak from hatching, and pressed its head gently against his hand. A warmth spread through Daniel's chest immediately, sharp and sudden, followed by something he could only describe as a quiet hum settling into his thoughts, like a second heartbeat matching his own. He gasped, pulling back slightly out of surprise, but the creature only followed his hand, unwilling to let the connection break. When Yara returned the next morning and saw what had happened, she immediately ran every scan she had brought with her, her hands shaking slightly with excitement. The readings confirmed what she had already suspected watching the two of them together. This was not simply a young dragon meeting a stranger. This was a bond, deep and immediate, the very thing old records had mentioned without ever explaining clearly. According to Yara's research, ancient texts described this kind of connection as something that used to exist between dragons and a single, chosen partner, a bond so rare that most species in the galaxy had never even seen it happen, let alone understand how it worked. It should not be possible, Yara said, staring at her scanner readings again and again as if they might change. Every species that tried to study dragons before the cataclysm reported the same thing. Dragons could be observed, sometimes even tamed carefully with great effort, but this kind of instant, deep bond, this was never recorded happening with any other species. Not once. Until now. Daniel barely heard her, too focused on the small creature curled against his leg, watching him with those steady golden eyes. He decided, without much thought, to call it Wren, a simple name that felt right the moment he said it aloud. Wren's ears, small and slightly pointed, twitched at the sound, and a soft, pleased rumble came from its chest, almost like a purr, confirming that the name had been accepted. Over the following days, Wren grew faster than anything Daniel had ever seen in a young animal, gaining strength and size noticeably every morning. More surprising than its rapid growth were the small, strange abilities it began showing almost immediately. It seemed to sense Daniel's moods before he expressed them, growing restless when he felt anxious, calm and playful when he relaxed. Once, when Daniel accidentally knocked over a heavy container of tools, Wren's wings flared out instinctively, and a faint shimmer of light seemed to bend around the falling container, slowing it just enough that it landed softly instead of crashing loudly against the floor. Yara documented everything carefully, her excitement mixed with growing concern. If dragons truly could bond this strongly, and if this ability to sense and even influence the world around them was real, then Wren was far more than a rare, beautiful creature. Wren was something the galaxy's older powers had feared enough to help wipe out completely generations ago. And now, on a quiet, dusty world at the edge of nowhere, a creature the galaxy believed extinct was awake again, bonded tightly to a lonely human who had never expected his life to change this much, this quickly, or in a way that already felt impossible to walk away from. Rumors travel faster than truth ever does, and by the time Daniel understood how far word had spread, it was already too late to stop it. Oren, the trader who had asked careful questions weeks earlier, arrived at Corvin one evening looking nervous rather than curious, glancing over his shoulder as he stepped off his ship. He pulled Daniel aside quickly, speaking in a low voice. "People are talking about more than rumors now," Oren said. "Someone official is asking questions along the trade routes. Someone from the council." Daniel felt his stomach tighten. Ren, now noticeably larger than a few weeks earlier, stood close beside him, sensing the shift in his mood immediately. The young dragon's golden eyes narrowed slightly, its wings shifting with quiet tension, as if it understood danger was approaching even without knowing the exact words being spoken. Yara, still staying nearby to continue her research, confirmed what Oren feared. Digging carefully through older records she had access to, she finally uncovered something that explained why the reaction to a living dragon was so extreme. The cataclysm, the ancient war that wiped dragons from the galaxy, had not simply been a natural disaster or unfortunate accident. It had been deliberate. Several of the older empires, the same species who still ran the Galactic Council today, had worked together to destroy dragons entirely, fearing the bonds dragons could form with certain other species. "There's more," Yara said quietly, showing Daniel a badly damaged record fragment on her screen. Before the cataclysm, dragons were not simply wild animals scattered across the stars. They were partners, bonded companions to another species, one the old records barely mentioned by name anymore, almost like the information was deliberately erased. Daniel stared at the fragment, incomplete symbols and broken sentences hinting at something larger than either of them could fully piece together. Yara pointed to one surviving phrase, translated roughly from an old, nearly forgotten language. The bonded ones, scattered and silenced. Neither of them could say for certain who those bonded partners had been, but the timing lined up with unsettling precision. Humanity's own oldest historical records were equally damaged and incomplete, describing a period long ago when human civilization had been suddenly and violently scattered across many worlds, its early history mostly lost. "You think it's us?" Daniel said slowly, not quite believing his own words even as he spoke them. Yara did not answer immediately, choosing her words with visible care. "I think it's possible. I think the reason Ren bonded with you so quickly, so completely, unlike anything ever recorded with another species, might be because that bond is not new at all. It might be something buried deep in human history, something the older empires worked very hard to make sure nobody remembered." Before Daniel could fully process what that meant, a shadow passed low over his shelter, followed by the distant hum of an approaching ship far larger than any trader vessel. Oren swore under his breath and backed toward his own small ship, clearly wanting no part of what was coming. The larger vessel landed a short distance away, kicking up a wide cloud of red dust, and a single figure stepped down from its ramp, moving with the calm, deliberate confidence of someone used to being obeyed. The figure introduced herself simply as Sela, a council enforcer sent specifically to investigate reports of an impossible discovery. Her expression remained carefully neutral as her gaze settled on Ren, who immediately moved to stand slightly in front of Daniel, small but clearly protective. Sela studied the young dragon for a long, silent moment before speaking again. "Do you understand what you're holding on to?" she asked Daniel directly, her voice calm but edged with something close to warning. Dragons were not destroyed by accident. They were removed because certain bonds were considered too dangerous to allow to continue. If what I am seeing here is real, my superiors will not simply let this exist quietly on some forgotten frontier world. Daniel felt Ren's presence pressing gently against his mind, steady and unafraid despite Sela's warning. He thought about 11 lonely years on Corvin, about the quiet, empty mornings before Ren had hatched, about how completely everything had changed in just a few short weeks. He was not willing to give that up simply because it made someone in a distant council chamber uncomfortable. "Then your superiors will have to come explain that to us directly," Daniel said, surprising himself with how steady his own voice sounded. Beside him, Ren let out a low, rumbling sound, not quite a growl, but close enough that Sela's eyes flickered with something that looked almost like respect, mixed carefully with genuine concern about exactly what she had just discovered on this small, forgotten, dusty world. 3 days after Sela's warning, the sky above Corvin filled with ships that did not belong to any trader Daniel recognized. He counted 6 vessels at first, then stopped counting when more appeared behind them, their dark hulls cutting sharp lines against the orange evening light. Word had clearly traveled beyond Silo alone. The council was not simply curious anymore. They were afraid, and fear, Daniel had learned long ago during his soldier days, often moved much faster than careful thinking ever did. Rowan had returned 2 days earlier with his trading ship, refusing to leave once he understood what was coming. Yara stayed as well, despite the obvious danger, insisting that someone needed to keep proper records of whatever happened next, in case the truth needed proof later. Even Oren, who had every reason to fly away and forget he ever knew Daniel, chose to stay hidden nearby instead, watching everything unfold with a nervous but determined expression. Ren had grown considerably larger in just a few short weeks, now roughly the size of a large dog, with stronger wings and a low, steady strength radiating from every movement. As the ships descended toward Corvin's dusty surface, Ren moved instinctively closer to Daniel, wings partially spread, golden eyes locked on the approaching fleet with a calm, focused intensity that felt far older than its short weeks of life should have allowed. Sela emerged again from the lead ship, this time flanked by several armed council soldiers. Though she kept her own weapon lowered, her expression tight, with something between duty and genuine worry. "I tried to warn you," she said quietly to Daniel as she approached. "My superiors want the creature contained immediately, and they want you questioned about how this happened. I cannot stop that order, but I can try to make sure nobody gets hurt if you cooperate quickly." Daniel stood his ground, one hand resting gently on Ren's back, feeling the young dragon's heartbeat pulse steadily beneath his palm, matching his own. "Ren isn't cargo to hand over," he said firmly. "And I'm not walking away from the first real family I've had in 11 years, just because it makes people nervous." The soldiers behind Sela raised their weapons slightly at his refusal, but before anyone could act further, something remarkable happened. Ren let out a sharp, clear cry, and the ground beneath the assembled soldiers seemed to shimmer briefly, the same strange bending of light Daniel had noticed once before when Ren had protected him from a falling container. Weapons flickered and briefly failed, small sparks jumping harmlessly along disabled circuits, leaving the soldiers confused and unable to fire. Yara, watching from nearby with her scanner still recording everything, gasped audibly. "The bond," she said quickly to Sela, stepping forward despite the tension. "It's not just emotional. Ren can sense danger directed at Daniel and actively respond to protect him. This is exactly what the old records described before they were erased. This is the ability the empires feared enough to start the cataclysm in the first place." Sela's carefully neutral expression finally cracked, replaced by something closer to genuine shock as she watched the disabled weapons and the calm, protective dragon standing firm beside a single, unarmed human. For a long, tense moment, nobody moved. Then, slowly, Sela raised one hand, signaling her soldiers to stand down completely. "This changes things," she said quietly, more to herself than to anyone else. "If the bond is real, and if it's this strong even at Ren's age, then containing this quietly is no longer realistic. Anyone watching right now already knows exactly what we're dealing with." She was right. Word of the standoff had already spread far beyond Corvin's dusty hills. Scattered human colonies across several nearby systems, colonies long treated as unimportant by the wider galaxy, had picked up fragments of the story through trader networks like Orcs. For the first time and longer than most of them could remember, humans across many worlds were talking to each other about something that made them feel less small, less easily dismissed by everyone else. Rowan stepped up beside Daniel, arms crossed, his presence a quiet show of support. "You wanted proof this bond was real," he said to Sela. "Now you have it, witnessed by your own soldiers. The question now is what your council plans to do about it, now that hiding it isn't an option anymore." Sela looked at Ren once more, then at Daniel, clearly weighing choices far larger than a simple military order. Behind her, the fleet of council ships sat silent and still against Corvin's darkening sky, their earlier confidence replaced by uncertainty. Something fundamental had shifted in just a few short minutes, and everyone present understood, in their own way, that Corvin's quiet, forgotten hills had just become the starting point of something far bigger than any of them had expected. Weeks after the standoff on Corvin, the quiet, dusty world Daniel once called home had become something he barely recognized. Council ships still visited occasionally, though now they came with scientists and negotiators rather than armed soldiers, each one careful and respectful in a way Daniel had never experienced from any alien visitor before. Word of the bonded dragon had spread across enough systems that ignoring it, or quietly erasing it the way the cataclysm once had, was no longer something even the oldest empires could manage. Sela had not disappeared after that tense evening. Instead, she returned several times over the following weeks, her role shifting slowly from enforcer to something closer to witness and advocate. She had seen Ren's protection firsthand, felt the disabled weapons fail under a bond older than any current record could fully explain, and that experience had changed her thinking more than any council briefing ever could. During one visit, she admitted quietly to Daniel that most of her superiors still argued fiercely about what to do next, some pushing for careful study, others for outright fear-driven control, but her own reports had made the truth impossible to simply bury again. Yara's research, meanwhile, continued to uncover more pieces of the buried history connecting humans and dragons. Old fragments, scattered across damaged records nobody had bothered translating properly in centuries, slowly formed a clearer picture. Long before the cataclysm, dragons and early human ancestors had shared exactly the kind of bond Daniel now had with Ren, a connection strong enough that the older empires of that time had feared losing control over both species entirely. Rather than risk that outcome, they had chosen to destroy the dragons and scatter humanity across the stars, deliberately erasing most records of the bond that once connected them. Understanding this did not erase generations of humans growing up believing their species was simply weaker, less important, and less capable than everyone else in the galaxy. But it did give people something they had been missing for a very long time, a reason to stand a little taller. Scattered human colonies, many of them barely surviving on the edges of charted space, began reaching out to each other more than they had in decades, sharing news, comparing old family stories, wondering aloud what else might have been buried alongside the truth about dragons. Rowan eventually expanded his trading routes specifically to carry news and messages between these scattered colonies, half joking that he had accidentally become humanity's unofficial messenger simply by refusing to leave Corvin during the standoff. Oren, surprising everyone including himself, decided to stay involved as well, quietly using his trading connections to help protect information about Ren from falling into the wrong hands before humans themselves were ready to share it properly. Daniel, for his part, found himself slowly stepping into a role he never expected or particularly wanted. People began arriving on Corvin not just out of curiosity, but hoping to understand more about the bond, about dragons, and about what it might mean for humanity's place among older, more established species. He answered their questions honestly, admitting often that he understood very little himself, still figuring things out day by day alongside Ren, who had grown further still, now large enough to comfortably carry Daniel on short flights above Corvin's dusty red hills. During one quiet evening, sitting outside his shelter and watching Ren stretch large wings against the setting sun, Daniel thought back to the man he had been just months earlier, alone, forgotten, convinced that nothing meaningful would ever happen to him again on this dusty, overlooked world. That version of himself felt distant now, almost like a different person entirely. He was not alone anymore, not just because of Ren's constant, steady presence in his mind, but because an entire scattered species was slowly beginning to remember it had a history worth being proud of. Late one night, while reviewing more of Yara's translated fragments, Daniel came across a final surviving note buried deep within the old vault records, one Yara had almost missed entirely. It mentioned, briefly and without much detail, that the vault beneath Corvin's hills had never been meant to hold only a single egg. Other similar chambers were referenced elsewhere, their exact locations lost to time, scattered somewhere across worlds nobody had properly explored in centuries. Daniel looked over at Ren, now curled contentedly nearby, golden eyes reflecting the last light of Corvin's long evening. He thought about all the other forgotten vaults that might still exist somewhere out there, waiting patiently the same way Ren once had, for someone willing to look a little closer. For the first time and longer than he could remember, Daniel felt genuinely excited about what might come next, not just for himself, but for every scattered human colony that had spent generations believing their story was already finished. As it turned out, humanity's story, much like the ancient dragons themselves, had simply been waiting quietly for the right moment to begin again.